Dömur mínar og herrar, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Reykjavik International Film Festival, I would like to welcome you all to the Masterclass with David Cronenberg. Gjör svo vel.
Hello, welcome to Masterclass. It's my fault that we're a bit late, because I had to write this speech and this Masterclass. Do you have Siri?
Yeah. Should I ask Siri why you were late?
Yeah.
Yeah.
My name is Matti Thorsson, and I'm an Icelandic Canadian filmmaker. And this is David Cronenberg, a Canadian filmmaker. And I'd like to welcome you to this masterclass on behalf of RIFF. And I want to thank RIFF for bringing Cronenberg here, Arnór, Sveinsson, and all the other people involved. I'd like to try to focus on this mostly from a filmmaker's perspective. I'm not really a theorist or a critic, although the first time I met Cronenberg was in '92. I did an interview in his office in Toronto when he was releasing Naked Lunch. And I was even more nervous then than I am now. And but he's a very generous person and took good care of me that day. Thank you. And he's a very he's very good with theory and forming his thoughts. And I mean he just published a book.
A novel. Yes, more important.
More importantly, and after what, 50 years of gestation?
No. What I mean, I thought that I would be a novelist. I never thought that I would be a filmmaker. My father was a writer, a journalist, and I always aspired to writing and literature as a career. And it was only because I was interested in the technology of film that I somehow got seduced or derailed into filmmaking, and only last year did I publish my first novel, so that's why I think it's 50 years late. But it wasn't gestating for 50 years, that's the difference. Anyway, that's what that was.
Okay. I think the first film I saw, I was nearly, 14 or 15, it was The Brood, and I was blown away by that. I didn't know what the hell was going on, and fortunately it's still like that with your films. They challenged me and they made me think of the human condition in a new and exciting way. They are always interesting, they're never dull. And you're just one of those filmmakers that's constantly stimulating, and I always look forward to the work. Cronenberg has been making films since the 60s, starting with experimental horror shorts, existential horror shorts, From the Drain, and Stereo, Transfer.
Yeah, Stereo I think was my first feature. In those days, a feature film would be, a film festival would accept your film as a feature if it was over 60 minutes. So Stereo and Crimes of the Future were both 63 minutes long, to make sure that they qualified. And to my surprise, these films that were made really very handmade. It was basically me shooting with my friends as actors. They were accepted as feature films in the Edinburgh Film Festival and the Adelaide and Auckland film festivals in Australia and New Zealand. And so that was very early on. I had a strangely international career in terms of film festivals, not certainly in terms of film distribution, but and so even then, film festivals were an important way that you could have unusual, difficult films that would never get a commercial film release seen, and that's happening today. I think there's almost I think that the world has about 600 film festivals now, and that is a kind of strange distribution system for films that you might never see except at those festivals, and maybe on YouTube eventually, and will never appear in a cinema because the cost of releasing a film like that are too high. And even my last film, Maps of the Stars, which had some recognizable Hollywood names in it, basically is a digital distribution. I mean, it's been seen in some theaters, but mainly it ended up being seen mainly digitally. And I think that's really, there's been a big schizophrenia with big Hollywood movies that cost $200 million, and they own the theaters, and then you get a whole level of other films that are just never get to the cinema. I think that's where things are going these days.
So wasn't it nice yesterday when we walked into the video store to see the DVD copy? Yes, but as you know, and as the owner of the DVD store knows, that too is those days are numbered. Yeah. It's all going to be streaming and downloads, and there'll be very few DVDs. After those first films, you do you did a studio or Videodrome was for Universal, wasn't it? Yes, weirdly enough, that was Universal. Hollywood is a very strange place, and this was, of course, this was 1982, I think. For some reason, Universal Studios, which was one of the most conservative possible studios at the time, distributed my film Videodrome, which was, they didn't really know what to do with it, but somehow they distributed it. It was just very strange. That will never happen again. That kind of thing will never happen again. Now they distribute Everest. Yeah, well, they know what the business is that they're in. It's huge blockbusters and sequels and franchises and so on. That's what the studio movie business has become. Yeah. But you still, after Videodrome, it's the Dead Zone. Yes, and that's for Dino De Laurentiis. Yes. Did Hollywood. Yes. Well, Dino was never really Hollywood. Dino De Laurentiis was an independent sort of progress update. Go for your stand goal. 5 of 12 hours. This is my Apple Watch. It's very concerned that I stand at least 1 minute every hour. It's the ghost of Steve Jobs lives right here on my wrist. And speaking of Jobs, there's a movie called Jobs. This is Danny Boyle directing, Michael Fassbender as Steve Jobs, and we'll see if that qualifies as a mainstream movie. I can't imagine that it will be, but anyway, these are all strange. What were we talking about before? The Dead Zone. Yeah, Dino De Laurentiis was a kind of a maverick Italian producer who moved to Hollywood. He had to flee Rome because of some kind of debt things and fraud and whatever, and he reestablished himself in America. I really loved him. He was a really unique character, even in those days. And he did movies with Ingmar Bergman and Federico Fellini and won Oscars. And anyway, he was a terrific, interesting guy. Fortunately, when I made The Dead Zone, he was obsessed with David Lynch's film Dune, which was a much bigger production, and so he left me alone and didn't interfere, as moguls tend to do. And but he did interfere a lot with David Lynch's film. So I managed to make that film
as I wanted to make it, basically. Whereas Lynch had more problems with, we won't get into that. That's for David Lynch to talk about, not me.
But was that also the first time you worked on something that was not your script? Jeffrey Boehm wrote the screenplay for the Dead Song.
Yeah, that's true. I had written my own scripts, and I thought that to be an auteur, which in French means author, the French New Wave critics like Truffaut and Godard developed a theory of the author theory of filmmaking, and I interpreted it to mean that you had to write your own screenplay, and that you therefore had to be a writer-director to truly be an auteur. Weirdly enough, that is not what the French critics meant. What they meant was they were talking about old Hollywood filmmakers like Howard Hawks and John Ford, and they were saying even though they didn't write their own screenplays and they were part of a very well-organized studio system, somehow their personalities as directors still came through their directing, through the way they made their films. And it was an attempt by the French really to redeem these sort of workmanlike craftsmen of Hollywood, and to show that they were true auteurs in their own way, that their voices, their cinematic voices were still very strong, despite the fact that they were embedded in this very sort of rigorous studio system. So I thought that you had to, anyway, there I was thinking you had to write your own stuff. And frankly, nobody really wanted me as a director because I had only done some underground films, Stereo and Crimes of the Future, and a couple of shorts. But what they did want was my screenplay for Shivers, which was a kind of a unique horror film that nobody had ever seen anything quite like that before. You'll probably notice that the film Alien took a lot of things from my film Shivers, and that it is well known that Dan O'Bannon, who co-wrote Alien, knew my films very well, and some of it, it's the way it works. I mean, if your film is influential, it means people copy elements of it, and that's the way it goes. But they wanted my script. They didn't want me as director. I said, if you want my script, you have to take me as director. And eventually, a company in Montreal called Cinepix did end up producing my first couple of films. It was really at that time in Canada, there was no film industry. There were documentary films, there was TV, but there was really no film industry. People were not making feature films at all. So I had to really invent myself as a Canadian feature filmmaker. And since my first film was definitely a horror film, there was no tradition whatsoever of horror filmmaking in Canada. In fact, there was not a tradition of genre filmmaking. There were no thrillers, there were no detective movies, there were no action movies. It was all basically documentary stuff, like what life was on the prairies, or what it was like for the fishermen in the Maritimes and so on, kind of docudramas. That was really Canadian filmmaking. So my first film caused quite a lot of, it was quite a controversy, and even went to the Canadian Parliament where people were debating whether the government should invest in disgusting films like my film. And the answer ended up being yes, because it was the only film for years that actually made any money for the Canadian government for their investment. So I ended up able to make Rabbit as well. And in fact, the Canadian government has invested in almost every film that I've made, including Maps to the Stars, which was set in Hollywood, but still was mostly shot in Toronto with Canadian talent and so on. So government support has been very, very important to my filmmaking. As it is, I think, in most countries in the world except for the US, because it's all anti-Hollywood. Not against Hollywood, but it's counter-Hollywood. It's non-Hollywood filmmaking. Basically, Canadian filmmaking is what you would call independent filmmaking.
So after the Dead Zone, You still...
We have to return to the original question, actually.
Yeah.
So Shivers, Rabbit, The Brood, Videodrome, these were all scripts that I wrote myself. And then I was proposed an adaptation of a Stephen King novel, which was The Dead Zone, by Deborah Hill, and who was the producing it for Dino De Laurentiis. And it was so interesting to me to think of myself as doing that I said yes, and we ended up making the film, and I discovered that to mix your blood with another writer, in this case Stephen King, was really very exciting. And the fact that I hadn't written the script, I sort of oversaw the script. I chose the screenwriter and so on, but I didn't write the script myself. And it was definitely a blending of my sensibility and Stephen King's sensibility and the writer's sensibility. People who see The Dead Zone think it feels like the novel to them. But if you read the novel, you'll see that it's very, very different from the movie. But somehow, there really is no way to translate directly a novel into a film. The two media are really, really very different. And I know that even more now that I've written my first novel. They're completely different forms of art. What you can do is replicate the tone of the novel. You can't do it sort of specifically and in detail, but it feels like the novel. And that's what happened with The Dead Zone. It was the first adaptation of a Stephen King novel that he thought was good. He had many of his novels adapted, and he hated them all, and he really loved The Dead Zone, so it was a first for him. And then I realized after that I shouldn't worry about where does the film come from. It can come from your dream, it can come from your life, but it can also come from someone else's work. And so I've ended up working with some fantastic adaptations of novelists, J.G. Ballard for Crash, and William Burroughs for Naked Lunch, and David Wong's play for M. Butterfly, and so on and so on. Bruce Wagner for Maps of the Stars. So it's been, it changed my understanding of what filmmaking could be, and still be very personal to me.
Mm-hmm. And after The Dead Zone, you have The Fly.
Yes.
And which is your biggest sort of commercial hit.
Yes. And really the only remake I've done. Once again, when it was proposed to me, I turned it down, and then Mel Brooks talked to me. He was producing it. He had done Elephant Man with David Lynch, so he had some credibility as, of course he makes his own comedies, but as a producer he was very interested in making something quite different from anything that he would direct himself. And I said, well, look, I don't think this script, which is a rewrite, which is a rethinking of the original movie from the 1950s that starred Vincent Price and was really kind of a, it had some interesting things in it, but it was kind of a schlocky film. It wasn't great, and but it had some great moments. And I said, if I can rewrite this script completely, I would consider doing the movie. And so that's what happened, and they liked my rewrite, which was very extensive, and so I did The Fly.
How different is it to work with somebody like that, Mel Brooks, Dino De Laurentiis, as opposed to your producers, sort of the regular collaborators that you might have with your original material? Yeah.
Well, it's always an interesting relationship you have, but the main, technically I've not had final cut on all my movies, certainly not the ones in the beginning, and yet I have had final cut. This is really a question of will and Machiavellian manipulation. And sometimes you have to be very, very tricky to get what you want and to get the film to be what you think it should be. And so there are many ways you can do that. But for me, it's not confrontation. It's kind of subtle kind of Canadian subversiveness, I don't know what you call it, but there are ways that you have to be able to assess the people that you're working with. I mean, really, the first rule of good independent filmmaking is do not work with assholes. You know, I mean, you have to, there are many ways now that you can assess the people that you're going to work with, even actors. I mean, YouTube is very important now. Before I offer a role to an actor, especially one who's not well known, I look on YouTube to see the interviews that they've done. And you can get a sense of what they are as a person as opposed to what they are as an actor, and to understand whether they're going to be a lot of trouble on the set, or whether they will mesh with your understanding of what an actor should be. And so you end up eventually, because it's a hugely important part of filmmaking, is casting the film, but also casting the people that you'll work with. Because it can destroy your film before you even start if you're working with the wrong people.
Mm. And that's what you look for in other collaborators as well, as more of the human being quality than sort of technical.
Yeah, I mean it's just whether you in contract have the right of final cut, for example, or you have the right to cast anybody that you feel is the right person. Assuming that the money is possible. There are many ways to get around a contract. It will not really protect you. I mean, there are many producers, I won't mention any names, like the Weinsteins, but I won't. And, you know, where they have a secret editing room where they're editing the movie while you're editing your version of the movie. And of course that's very easy to do now digitally more than before. And you know that they don't really care what you're doing. They are going to present their own version of the movie. That's never happened to me, but it's because I haven't, you know, you don't work with people that you think you're going to run into that kind of problem with.
And you've never sort of, after The Fly, you never done another, like a studio project. I mean, you flirted with Total Recall. And
yes, I've flirted with Hollywood many times, actually. I think the most recent one was, I was going to do a Robert Ludlum spy novel called The Matarese Circle, and I wrote a script for it. And this was for one version of MGM, which keeps reinventing itself. And I talked to Tom Cruise. He loved the character that I had created for him. And Denzel Washington, met him. He was very interested, and it would have been Tom Cruise, Denzel Washington in The Matarese Circle. And I think it would have been a terrific movie. I don't know what actually might have happened with those guys on the set, whether you know, I just don't know. But I was curious enough, and if you're going to do a movie like that, you know that you are going to have to give up some of the things that you're used to, like total, absolute creative control, which is what I would have on most of the movies I've made. In return, you would get a big budget, you would be paid more money yourself, and you would get a major release of the film in more theaters than you'd ever had before. And I've talked to some directors who've done that. Some of them had the best fun that they ever had in their lives, and others had the worst, most horrific, traumatic experience in their lives, so you don't really know what would have happened. In any case, MGM went bankrupt. And so that ended The Matarese Circle. So it wasn't even my fault, and it wasn't their fault, not directly. And yes, I mean, Total Recall, I was very interested in doing that project, and I wrote a screenplay. I wrote actually 12 drafts of that screenplay, and eventually one of the producers, Reshoots, said to me, "You know what you've done? You've created the Philip K. Dick version of the movie." And I said, "Well, yeah, I mean, he wrote the novel, and isn't that what we're trying to do? And he said, no, we want Raiders of the Lost Ark go to Mars. I said, well, I wish you told me that a year ago, because then we wouldn't have had to go through this. And I wanted William Hurt to star in the movie, and they ended up with Arnold Schwarzenegger. So that shows you the difference in so-called vision that we have.
Did you see the movie?
Yeah, it had one or two moments which were actually taken from my script, because they owned it, they owned my script. They had paid me for it. So I think the best moments in it were actually from my script, and then the rest was terrible. But it was a success. It was a success. I have to admit that financially anyway.
Yeah. Okay, so after The Fly comes for like a movie called Dead Ringers, which I think I saw maybe 20 times, consecutive days. It was something that it's obviously done brain damage. Yeah, absolutely.
And I apologize for that.
That's why you're here. But
well, Dead Ringers was a project that it took 10 years to get that made. From the beginning, when I was approached by, it was Joe Roth, who was a guy who ended up head of Fox for a while, but at that time he was an independent producer, and it was based on the lives of two actual twins in New York City who were identical twin gynecologists who ended up committing suicide together. And it was the most incredible story that you couldn't make up, basically. And so there had been a novel written based on their lives, which was a terrible novel, really. But we had to say that our screenplay was based on that novel because of copyright issues and so on. When in fact the screenplay that I ended up working with some good screenwriters, and they just didn't get it. They couldn't produce what I felt was the movie.
I read the novel.
It's terrible.
Terrible.
Yeah, it was a terrible novel.
It's like a hollow thing.
Just and so I ended up writing the screenplay myself with a close friend of mine in Toronto named Norman Snyder, who was a writer and screenwriter, and we wrote it together. And it was totally not based at all on the horrible novel, even though in the credits it says that it is. And that's so that the children of the twin gynecologists would not sue us. That's basically what it is. And it is very fictionalized. It's not intended to be a biography of these doctors. But the story was incredible. But it did take 10 years of writing, rewriting, trying to finance. Finance falls through. And it was very cathartic to ultimately... Oh, also, I couldn't get any actors to play the roles, the twin roles. That's the other thing. That was famously... I have said, and it's accurate, I went to 30 of the most famous actors you could ever imagine. And they did not want to play gynecologists. That's the truth. The two things, the fact that it was gynecologists and the fact that they were twins. Now you'd think that any actor would be really challenged by the idea of playing twins. But what happened was that they were afraid of these twins because they were real. They were very similar to each other. They weren't that, most twin movies there's the evil twin and the good twin. And the evil twin does evil things and he blames the good twin for it. These were real people and they were very complex and their sexuality was very complex and so it actually scared a lot of the most famous actors you could imagine. And it wasn't until, and they were all North American actors and they would not play it. Italian American actors really could not deal with gynecology in particular. And then Anglo American actors could not deal with twins. So it was a little strange. And Jeremy Irons was the first credible actor that you could get financing for, who also had the acting chops to do the movie, because you have to be able to balance both. That's the thing. I mean, depending on the budget of your film, you have to have an actor who is famous enough to support that budget. So you can't just cast anybody, even if you had an unknown actor who was terrific. You couldn't finance it with that actor. So many things go into casting. It's a black art. You have to juggle many things, including the actor's passport. Now, why would that matter? Well, because when you're doing a co-production between Canada and Europe, let's say Canada and France or Canada and Britain, the actors, the lead actors, have to be from one of the co-producing countries. So you can't have an American actor, even if it's an American character, because it will not fit into the co-producing rules. So, for example, in Maps of the Stars, I only have one American actor, technically, because Julianne Moore has a British passport, and Rob Pattinson is British, and so on, even though they're playing American. So these are all the things behind the scene. I mean, no audience needs to know these things. Of course, they shouldn't know these things. But as a filmmaker, these are the things, as an independent filmmaker, these are the things you have to juggle. One of the interesting things for me about doing A History of Violence or The Dead Zone was that those were not co-productions, and therefore I could use as many American actors as I wanted. But other films, you really restricted to maybe one American actor, and that's it. So all of these things. So Jeremy Irons was the first credible actor who showed some interest in playing these doctors, and who was not afraid to play the doctors. And even then, because it took so long to get the production together, when I went back to him maybe a year later, he said, "No, I've had second thoughts and I don't think." So I had to fly immediately to London and seduce him again. As a double, my second seduction of Jeremy Irons, to get him to play the role. And ultimately he did, and of course he was wonderful in it. And the technology, we weren't shooting digitally then, so we actually had to invent our own technology in order to twin Jeremy in the movie. We used some stuff that ended up becoming standard twin technology before the advent of digital filmmaking, which has made it much easier to twin people. But then it was really quite tricky, very difficult. One shot could take you 2 days to do.
Would you say that for you personally, Dead Ringers was a turning point? Many critics, and if you look at your body of work, it sort of looks like that. But for you, as a human being, was there something?
As a human being, I sort of think of myself as a dog, actually, but I can bark. My wife would be shocked that I expose my dogginess to all my things. Anyway, yes, that movie, My Life as a Dog, really resonated for me. So, well, Dead Ringers, yes, it was taken very seriously, but it was still an outsider film, you know. I remember being in Chicago. In those days, you'd had to travel to 10, 20, 15 cities in the US promoting your movie. And I was in Chicago doing a radio show. And the interviewer, the guy interviewing me, who had a very resonant, wonderful, powerful voice, said to me and to his audience, he said, "If Jeremy Irons doesn't win the Oscar for Best Actor for Dead Ringers, then there is no God." And I've been an atheist ever since, because he didn't. He didn't win, and I realized there was no God, and that was it. Jeremy did win the Oscar the next year for another movie, and he...
Reversal of Fortune.
Yeah. A Reversal of Fortune. And when he accepted the Oscar, he thanked me. Because he knew that it was really the way, what really brought him to the awareness of Hollywood and of critics and so on, was Dead Ringers. And even though the Academy was too timid to vote for a movie that was that dark, they knew that Jeremy really should get an Oscar, so they gave it to him for his next movie. Those are the breaks.
That's how the deal works in Hollywood, right? The films after Dead Ringers, I mean, we have Naked Lunch, we have Existence. You go back to original material with Existence.
Yeah.
That was an older.
I was interested in the gaming culture that had developed. I never really closed the door on making a horror film or a genre film. It's just I didn't want to be boring and I didn't want to repeat myself. And so eventually I thought that I had done everything that I could do within the horror genre, and I just, without really thinking about it much, just started to do different kinds of movies, like Dead Ringers, which has horrific elements, but is not really a horror film. And but I never closed the door on it, and the gaming culture and computer life in general kind of intrigued me, and so Existence was my kind of foray into exploring that element of surreality that many people live in, that is the internet reality and so on.
Have you tried Oculus?
I have. It makes me motion sick. Oculus Rift, yeah. I don't think 3D gaming is remotely close to being viable yet. That's my feeling. It's okay, but it's not really there yet.
Could you see yourself as a game designer? Or?
Well, game design is now a huge business, and it's immense. My son has been involved in it a little bit, and but it's like working with the studio. I mean, if you work with some of the huge, the big studios, and there are a couple in Canada, it's as bureaucratic and as conservative and as franchise oriented as the studio.
Mm-hmm.
So it also breaks down into their radical, independent game designers now who work, on a small level, on small budgets, and maybe it's only for your iPhone or something. And so it's not, you can't really escape into game design from movie making. You end up in the same situation.
Mm.
But the millions and millions of dollars, there are games that cost $200 million. That's extraordinary.
Okay, before we go, we should probably have some questions from the audience, but before that, I just want to ask you a bit about where you stand in it, because we talked about the technology in Dead Ringers and the sort of technology of the filmmaker, emerging technologies, digital technologies today. Some directors bemoan the loss of film, a negative, and the whole sort of work ethic that goes with that. What do you think?
I was happy to see film die, and it is dead. It's dead. I think digital technology is hugely far superior. And in fact, even those people like Spielberg who still shoot on film, 2 seconds later it's been digitized and then they're editing digitally, and it's, or eventually it will be digital. It has to go into a computer for color timing, and so no one does chemical color timing anymore because it's so clumsy and so awkward, as was the editing of film. I mean, it really was very primitive compared with digital stuff. Sound had been digital on film sets for many, many years, and it's taken more time before the video technology was able to match film, but now it far surpasses it. I don't care, all those Kodak ads in American cinematography about how wonderful film is, forget about it. I was, even as I was, I have great affection for typewriters, typewriter technology. Anybody who's seen Naked Lunch would know that. But I was really happy to see typewriters disappear, because word processing is so much more works the way your mind works. You know, you jump around and you move things around, and when you're typing, it's all very linear, and it's the same with the old film editing was so linear. And with digital editing, you can just jump around and move around very quickly, the way basically your mind works, in a mosaic way, not a linear way. And so for me, there are many things about digital technology too that you wouldn't, for a filmmaker. I remember the first time I saw a print, what we called a release print, that is to say a print that is made for the cinema. You do what's called an answer print. It comes right off the negative, and you get the color and the contrast and the black levels just perfect, the way you want. And now they make a duplicate negative, an interneg, another neg, and then they make the release prints, and they look terrible. The prints that are actually going to the theater for people to watch are horrifyingly awful, compared with that beautiful answer print that you had that looked just the way you wanted. The blacks have all gone green and are now grainy. The highlights are burned out and have no detail. With digital, of course, you can reproduce endlessly, and it's exactly the same. There's no deterioration in quality. That's the huge advantage of digital, and it's immense. And the other thing is, of course, I would go to a theater and see my film, and the print had been shown many, many times, and it had scratches everywhere, and the sprockets had worn, and the image would be moving around like that, and there would be jumps where the projectionist had ripped some of the frames and had to repair them. And I mean, it was horrible to watch. It doesn't mean that you can't have bad digital projection, which we know from some projection that just happened here yesterday. But it's the chances of bad projection are much smaller than with film. So I really have no. I mean, the one thing I do miss about film is the smell of the film, you know, in the editing room. But you could get a Kodak air freshener, and then you'd have the smell without all the disadvantages of film. So that, to me, that's it. And I think there should be ode to Kodak, really, for perfume maybe.
Okay, one more thing for me before we go to questions. When do we have to go to questions? Is it no? Basically, what is your workday like, the creative process of writing a script, and also do you follow the standard rule book of screenwriting?
Well, I haven't written a screenplay for, I guess Cosmopolis was my last screenplay, which is 2 movies ago. I'm very irregular in my writing habits. When I'm writing a novel, you're more regular because it's such a long slog of writing. It could be 2 years of writing, and you have to be very regular in that. But every screenplay has been different, and of course it's different if it's based on a novel compared with if it's original, obviously. With Cosmopolis, I was given this book by Don DeLillo, and I had read Don DeLillo, but I hadn't read Cosmopolis, and I wasn't sure. I thought, I don't know if this could be a movie, really. Let me see. So what I did was I took my laptop, and I had the novel, and for the first 3 days, I have a screenwriting program, and I just wrote the dialogue as it was in the novel, without changing anything. And then the next 3 days, I filled in details of where the dialogue was being spoken and some of the other details. And in 6 days, I had a screenplay. And I looked at it and I thought, this is a movie. And not only is it a movie, it's a movie I really want to make. But that had never happened that way before. You know? So it really, every project is unique. And it really fits in with my feeling. People talk to me about themes, for example, doing the theme of identity or the theme of whatever they call body horror, which I don't really understand. But anyway, it wasn't I've never used that term. And what I say is, of course, the discovering of themes and connections amongst your movies is really for critics to do, or academics, and it's absolutely a lovely exercise and can reveal many things. But creatively, it gives me nothing. You know, it doesn't. So each movie that I do is like it's like the first movie ever made, basically, is what it feels like. And I don't think about my other movies, and I don't think about other people's movies that might be similar or might have interconnections. I need the purity and the focus of just whatever this particular project is. And I don't think about what I'm known for or what I've done before. You know, to me those are distractions, and there are many ways you can paralyze yourself as a creative person, no matter what your art form is. And many people have paralyzed themselves, and some of them drink, and some of them take drugs to dissolve the paralysis. And others just use, you know, mind tricks of their own in order to avoid that kind of paralysis. And for me, that's one of the things, is just that incredible focus on the project, as though no movie had ever been made before this, and that's how you're gonna proceed.
So, with Cosmopolis, you take the novel basically, and that's the way you worked it in this case. Now, in some instances, or in Hollywood, or in like script developing, you know, where screenplays go through rigorous script developing processes.
Yes, it's called development hell. And people go through years of development hell when it's a studio, for example. And my friend Guillermo del Toro, for example, worked on and he's doing very commercial movies, and he loves that. He loves big monster movies with robots versus dinosaurs and stuff. He loves that. And still, he spent 4 years developing a movie, a huge movie, and then it fell apart. And then he had nothing left, you know, and he had to start from scratch again. And this is working, you know, with the intent to make a commercial movie, not as though he's trying to make an art movie out of a commercial movie. So that is what you call development hell. Also, my friend Edgar Wright, who's a lovely young English filmmaker, and he worked 7 years on Ant-Man. You know, this is a comic book character, and I think it was Marvel or DC, I can't remember. And they were about to shoot, and then the toy company, I think it was Mattel, who had a contract for the action characters from the movie Ant-Man, said, we need a female action character. We realize we're missing that, and so you have to rewrite the entire script to include this female character. And he left the project in complete dismay, you know, that because it meant rewriting, rethinking everything that he'd already been doing for 7 years. So the fact that you're working with a studio and you don't have to go raising the money from 10 different sources, which you do in an independent film. I mean, as a director of an independent film, you sometimes find yourself at the Cannes Film Festival, for example, not to promote a film, but to start to pitch your project to various distributors from all over the world, hoping that they will advance you money for their territory and so on. You don't have to do that if you're working with a studio, but you do have to deal with the studio, and that can be devastating.
Mm.
So for me, working with a famous Portuguese producer named Paulo Branco, who's produced over 200 movies and has the reputation of being like a Portuguese pirate. He's a very, very lovely man, produced many, many movies, but he, you know, is very famous for juggling money from one project to the other and so on. He loved the script immediately. He had no problem with it. It was just, you know, basically producers like him and Jeremy Thomas, who produced Crash and Naked Lunch for me, they believe in, if they're giving the film to a director, you really give the film to the director. You don't give the film to the director and then second guess everything that he does and criticize everything he does. You see, I believe in your ability to do this movie, that's why we're working together. And they let you do it, and they support you. And those are the producers you have to work with, I think.
I wanted to... there is a synopsis here I found on IMDb, just going back.
Sorry, what?
Just going back to the origin of your movies.
Oh.
There's a synopsis I want to read here. Sometime in the future, the Canadian Academy for Erotic Inquiry is investigating the theories of parapsychologist Luther Stringfellow. Where do you get the Canadian Academy for Erotic Inquiry?
Where did I get it?
Yeah.
I made it up. It's a fantasy, it's not a well-known thing, but Canadians are very erotic. Very. And we have an affinity with Iceland, of course, because we have many northern territories, and there's a famous book of poetry, Canadian poetry, called Love Where the Nights Are Long. And that's, we have a deep winter as well. So there is that connection. Now, were you going to ask?
No, it's a good answer, but yeah, you mentioned poetry. Do you think you have a book of poems in you as well?
Sorry?
A book of poems? Poetry? Do you think you would write a book of...
No, I will not write poetry. I have great respect for poetry, and I've studied poetry in many, many languages, including Anglo-Saxon poetry, which had led me to read the Icelandic sagas, which I have done, many of them. But no, I'm not a poet. Prose writing is really something I love and have always loved and have always had respect for, which is one of the reasons I work in my filmmaking with adaptations of really great, wonderful writers.
Are you working on a project now, or?
I am thinking about a project. I'm thinking about working on a project, yeah. The thing about writing a novel is there's really no pressure because nobody cares, But this is very good. I think that's very good for me. There's no money pressure because there's no money. And there's no insistence, there's not people phoning you saying, where is the script, where is the novel? So that's good for me. One of the interesting things for me about writing my novel, which is called Consumed, and I think you should all download it from Amazon right now. Right now on your cell phones, this book. I had written short stories and so on as a young person, but writing a novel is quite a different thing. And to my surprise, it was not at all like screenwriting. It was much more like directing. Because in a screenplay is a very strange kind of writing, very unusual. The only thing that goes directly from a screenplay to the screen is the dialogue. Everything else, nobody cares. When you're writing the screenplay, you don't try to be very elegant in your descriptions of actions or places or faces and so on. In fact, you don't even want to describe the characters in great detail because Tom Cruise is going to play that role, and you're not going to describe that character as being 5'8", so or 7, and so you don't get credit for wonderful prose writing in a screenplay. In fact, it's a detriment. Whereas when you're writing a novel, you are doing everything. You are casting it. You are creating the characters in the flesh. You're describing them in great detail. You're doing the costumes, the lighting, the camera moves, the locations, everything. And it's much more like directing, I realize. And you're moving the characters around the room the way you would as a director, and not which you wouldn't do in a screenplay. That would be considered presumptuous that you should write camera moves into a screenplay. So that was interesting for me.
Yeah, I recommend the novel. I'm on chapter 3, and it's I can't wait to finish it when the festival's over. Are there questions now from the audience? I'd like to Yeah.
Two in the back there.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about scanners, because I had heard the story that quite a few of the scenes were written the day of shooting for them. And I wanted to ask if that was true, the story I had heard, and what it was like working like that.
Yeah, it is true. And Scanners was definitely the most difficult movie I have ever made in my career. And one of the reasons was that in those days in Canada, sometimes the money was there before the movie was there. It seems strange now, but there were tax write-offs. So in sort of October, suddenly the accountants for many doctors and lawyers and dentists would say to their clients, "You need a tax write-off, you've made too much money." And so they would invest in your movie, but it would only come at the end of the year. So suddenly, I would get a producer saying, "Do we have any ideas for a movie?" And I would say, "Yeah, there's these psychic, this kind of underground, these people kind of can read minds, and okay, we're shooting in 2 weeks." And now that now seems like paradise, because you don't get that money that easily anymore. But the downside was that you had to make the movie. And of course, you were totally unprepared. And of course, there's a lot of special effects and things in Scanners, explosions and gunshots and so on. And famously, an exploding head. And so we started to shoot, and it was very cold in Montreal at the time. It was late fall, and it got really cold. And we were completely disorganized. And so I was often, while everybody else would go to lunch, I would stay on the set writing what we were going to shoot later that afternoon. And that's not a good way to make a movie. It really isn't. And we did have to do reshoots, which I normally never do. But they weren't really the normal kind of reshoots where you're reshooting something that didn't work very well. These were scenes that were actually written to make sense of what we had done before. Half the time we didn't know what the plot was about or what was going on. And in the movie, I learned a lot, because while we were editing the movie, sometimes you'd see a character and then you'd cut away to another character. The off-camera character kept talking, but that was dialogue that I would write while we were editing the movie, to make sense of what was going on, because a lot of it didn't make any sense. However, it turned out to be the #1 film in North America. It was my first film that was the #1 film for some reason, and it was very successful, and it has been, imitated many times and so on. But it was not a good way to make movies, and I don't recommend doing that. I mean, it just talk about pressure. It was huge, and there was a lot of craziness and neurosis and a lot of difficult times with that movie. And I don't. It's as I say. I knew that if I survived Scanners, I could survive anything.
I was curious to ask about how do you value music in your films, and what's your process working with composer Howard Shore?
Is that a two-type question? What was the first part?
Yeah, how you value music in your films? What's the role of music from your
What's the role of music?
And how you work with
and your relationship
composer.
with Howard Shore?
Yeah. Well, Howard is also from Toronto, Canada, and we knew each other growing up there. I was quite a bit older than Howard, but we knew each other, and we have mutual friends. And our careers sort of worked together. I mean, The Brood was only the second film that he wrote music for, and The Brood was the first movie I did that had original music. Before that, Shivers and Rabid, we couldn't afford original music, so we used what they call drop needle music. That is, you can buy music that's already created and sort of edited for your film and so on. And that's sort of Shivers and Rabid, that's where the music came from. So The Brood was the first original score for me, and it was Howard's second score. And it was because he had done one movie score already, because he was Canadian, because I knew him, and we had a rapport. And it's a very interesting thing, because music is, you can't really, it's very difficult to talk about it, to be articulate about it. It's very emotional, of course, and it has many associations for people that are very hard to control. For some people, a rock and roll song is very sad because it reminds them of the girlfriend that they lost, and for other people it's very happy because it reminds them of the girlfriend they married. So you can't really control all of the aspects of film, music, and so you have to have a real rapport with the person who's composing the music for your movie, and also they have to have a real rapport with the movie that you've made. And with Howard, I just found it really I mean, we don't talk a lot about the music, and when we do, it's rather abstract, as you might imagine. And sometimes it's odd. Like for example, Naked Lunch, we said, okay, this is set in the 1950s in America. What kind of music would William Burroughs have listened to? And it turned out that Burroughs wasn't really very interested in music. He doesn't reference it or think about it very much. So we thought, well, these characters probably should be listening to jazz, even though Burroughs did not listen to jazz. And then I said, when I was in Copenhagen in 1965, living there for a year, I went to a concert of Ornette Coleman, who was this brilliant American jazz musician. And because of the Vietnam War, many, many Americans and many American musicians left America and ended up in Scandinavia and various countries because they didn't want to be drafted and be sent to Vietnam. And so I saw Ornette Coleman, and I said, his music, which is very anarchistic, seems really right for Naked Lunch. And Howard said, well, I know Ornette very well. Why don't we ask him? And that's how it started. Howard knows everybody in the music world. And he has a really fine sensibility in terms of what works for the movie. From opera to, he wrote an opera for my movie based on my movie of The Fly, which I directed in Paris. It's the only time I've ever directed theater, was an opera. So we have a really, really intimate, intricate relationship. And basically the only movie that he didn't do the music for was The Dead Zone. And that was because Dino De Laurentiis had a music producer working for him who really had his own favorite and manipulated things to the point where they couldn't make a deal with Howard. And that's why he didn't end up doing the music for The Dead Zone, and Michael Nyman did. He did a very beautiful score, I have to say, but it was the only time I hadn't worked with Howard. So I don't know if that really is an answer to your question, but it's a very intimate relationship if you have, I know that it's a more European way of working. In Los Angeles, I think even with the cameramen, cinematographers, you get the guy who won the Oscar last year. You get the guy who's hot. Whereas in Europe, the idea is that you work with the same people over and over again, and you develop a deep relationship with them. Your cameraman, your production designer, and my orientation was always more towards European filmmaking in that sense, in terms of the people that I work with. Could you put the microphone closer, man?
About the independence of filmmaking, and you've talked a lot about the manipulation of studios and all kind of investors manipulating the movies. But I'm just wondering how can you make and how do you find the balance between making a movie independent, making like you wanted to, and also get the funding and all this, make it.
So basically the question is how do you maintain the balance of making your vision, of creating your vision and funding that vision?
Yeah. Well, I think in a way I've actually explained that. It is you have to find the right people to work with. I'm not, a producer in the sense that I don't go around and raise the money, but you have to find, a producer whose sensibility matches your own. That's basically it. And you can do that by seeing the movies that they make. For example, if you look at the movies that Jeremy Thomas has made, they're pretty. He's worked with Bernardo Bertolucci. You see who they've worked with, Now, if you're a very young filmmaker, you might have to start working with producers who have not done much. And then it's a personal relationship. My son has made a movie called Antiviral, which was very exciting because we were both at the Cannes Film Festival together. His film was being shown and my film was being shown, and that was really quite delightful. But he worked with a producer who really hadn't done much, but who he had gone to film school with. And so that, in fact, I never went to film school, but he did, and he said that the most important thing that happened at film school was the relationships that he made with other young filmmakers, rather than the practical aspects or the theoretical aspects of filmmaking, which you can learn yourself, absolutely. But it's meeting those other people and working with them and understanding how people have to work together. That was the key. So, the other thing too is how I got started and the things that I did are in some ways irrelevant now because everything has changed. Times are different. So it's hard for me to give advice about how you should get into filmmaking now because the landscape is completely different.
And the landscape is different, and even this Hollywood way of working has seeped into independent filmmaking. Even in our country, Iceland, you have like script doctors who tell you cannot do this, you have to do this. The hero has to be sympathetic and he has to go through this, and then and it becomes a very, very like a straitjacket way of working.
Yeah. Well, I think part of the problem is that there are producers who really don't understand the creative process, and they think that there's a scheme for it. For example, even in Hollywood now, for example, I mentioned Guillermo del Toro. He has started a company which specializes in pre-visualization. What is previs? Well, it's basically you are making the movie in your computer to show to studio executives who have no imagination. Seriously, they read a script and they can't imagine the movie because they're not really movie makers. They're sort of deal makers and corporate people. And so you make a fake movie that's like a video game. And I saw a version, for example, of Total Recall, which every shot was there, and it was like a video game with big, spaceships and stuff. And the irony was that the guys who had made this previs, and there was no director involved. It was before they hired a director, and so
so they previs the movie before a director.
The lead character looked like Eric Bana, the actor Eric Bana, because at the time he had been cast, but the movie ended up with Colin Farrell instead. So you had this previs with Eric Bana, and the Japanese head of Sony said, Total Recall is going to be a terrific movie, I've seen the previs. And so you can imagine being a director who is now plugged into that, and the studio is expecting you to do every shot as it was in the previs. is a very debilitating kind of movie making. I don't know whether the director who ended up directing it, because this was a remake of Total Recall we're talking about, not the original one with Schwarzenegger. And I don't know if the director managed to defeat that. The movie did look good, but it wasn't a good movie. So I don't know if he followed the previous exactly or not, but you see the expectations are there. The head of Sony Pictures thought that he'd seen the movie already. And now you, the director, are just going to paint by the numbers. And very, very strange. And I think storyboarding, the idea of storyboards, that you have a kind of cartoon version of the movie done by a storyboard artist, that too was done partly to plan complex special effects sequences. I've never done storyboards. I don't do storyboards at all. When I'm on the set, I'm just inventing it at the moment. You know, I have the actors rehearse the scene, and then my director of photography and I decide how to shoot it afterwards. I don't know how I'm going to shoot it until I actually see the actors doing the scene. It's like a piece of theater at that point. But young directors who've gone to film school, they have this pack of storyboards, which is every shot. And I've been on the set. One guy, I think he was doing Silent Hill, and he wasn't even looking at the actors. He was looking at his storyboards as they were shooting. It was very odd. And I think the previs is now an extension of storyboards. It's even more. It's like living storyboards. And the thing is that the storyboards for Total Recall cost $500,000, which is more than the budget of some movies. So it's a very, it's a kind of weird industrial enterprise rather than a creative movie making, as far as I'm concerned.
Right, we've got time for one more question.
Can we have a question here?
Yes.
This better be a good one, if it's going to be the last one. No pressure. See, now you know what it's like.
You talked about attending the festivals and the importance of film festivals. Unlike many of your generation, you've described yourself as a novelist who makes movies, not a film fan or a film fanatic who makes movies. The Scorseses, the Spielbergs, these are film nerds who are making films, and their films echo that, Tarantino. So what is the movie that you saw that thought, this is what I want to do? What are the movies you still see that continue to excite you, even if they don't necessarily overtly play a role in your creative process?
Mm-hmm. Well, I was never a film nerd. I was kind of a literature nerd, really, I saw, in Toronto, we are almost literally halfway between Europe and Hollywood. And I think I was influenced by films coming from both places. And as a kid, I saw cowboy movies and what we called sword fighting movies, Errol Flynn as Robin Hood and all that kind of stuff. It was all great. I never thought of myself as making film. Films seemed to come from somewhere else. It wasn't something that you could do yourself. And so, there were two moments. One was I was a child, and we used to go to the theater every Saturday to see movies. And in the neighborhood that I lived in Toronto, there would be a stream of children, like lemmings, going to the cinema. And it wasn't, we weren't accompanied by parents or any of that thing that happens now where people are totally terrified to let their kids out on the street by themselves. We all went by ourselves.
Were you going to the Eglinton or the university?
This was in Canada.
Which theater were you in?
Yeah. Sorry?
Which theater, the Eglinton or the university?
No, it was called the Pylon. And it was on College Street. And I remember coming out of the theater having seen, Hopalong Cassidy or some cowboy movie. And across the road was a theater called The Studio. And it only showed Italian films because the area that I lived in Toronto was very much full of Italian immigrants. And so the films were in Italian, the audience was Italian. And I saw people coming out of that movie, and they were weeping, they were crying, and they were all adults, there were no kids. And I thought, this is extraordinary. Some movie has caused these adults to come out on the street weeping. What was that movie that had that power to make grown-up people weep? Well, I crossed the road and I saw it said La Strada. It was Fellini's La Strada, which later when I saw it, I was weeping too. So that was the first inkling I had that movies could have an extraordinary power, not just an entertainment for children, but could be, a powerful emotional event for an adult. And then the next thing was a little movie called Winter Kept Us Warm, which was a student film made at University of Toronto. And the thing that shocked me when I saw it was that it had my friends in it as actors. Now, you can't reproduce that now, but the idea that people you knew could be in a movie was shocking. It never occurred to me that that was possible. And I understood from that movie, which was quite a lovely movie. It was about two students coming to the University of Toronto, and they sort of had a sort of gay relationship without acknowledging it and stuff. I suddenly thought, I'd like to try that, and I can see that it's doable. The fact that you could make a movie, that was the striking thing. Now every kid now knows you can make a movie, and you can make a movie with, with Final Cut and with your iPhone. But then it was just not accessible, and suddenly this movie meant access. So it didn't really have to do with whether the movie was good or not, although it was, or whether it was the kind of movie I wanted to make, which it wasn't. It was access, that you could do this. This is something you could do, and that's the movie.
Are there still movies that make you cry?
Sorry?
Are there still movies that make you cry?
Oh, of course, yeah.
And on that note, I would like to thank you, David, for sharing your stories with us and being here and being an inspiration.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure. Really, I've been very happy to be here.